Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Jo Ann Finkelstein. She is a clinical psychologist and the author of a new book called Sexism Sensibility Raising Empowered, Resilient Girls in the Modern World. This was such a great book and such a great conversation, whether you are the parent of girls or the parent of boys. I think a lot of us think that we've really come a long way in terms of the sexism in our culture. And while we have, we are still swimming in a sea of sexism and gender bias. And that became even more apparent to me, not only as I get older, but as I read Jo Ann's book and as we are heading into an election in the United States that a lot of people are saying a woman couldn't win. And regardless of how you feel politically, the idea that a woman couldn't win as president still really, to me, shows that we are still living in this world where girls and women are not deemed as competent as boys and men. This is a really important listen, lots of concrete ideas that Jo Ann gave us and a very interesting conversation. And I also just want to warn you that I was reading a quote from her book and I could not get through it without crying. It really moved me. I tried a couple times and I couldn't do it, but it was so important. I decided just to go with it. So I apologize if it's hard to understand what I'm saying. I hope you can understand what I was saying because I really loved the quote and the conversation that we had about it. So you hear me cry. If you know me and if you've been in my membership community, that I actually cry a lot. But I have managed so far in 3 years to not cry in the podcast. And that ends with this episode that I did cry. I also want to say that we put links to some really great resources of Jo Ann's in the show notes. So make sure you check those out. As always, if you could share this episode with the parent who you think could use it or who could learn from it or who might enjoy it, please do. I love it when people share. If this resonated with you, choose a couple of friends and screenshot it and text it to them. Let's dive into this conversation and meet Jo Ann. Hi, Jo Ann. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's so great to be here.
So tell us the title of your new book and how you came to write it and maybe just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. The title of the book is Sexism Sensibility Raising Empowered, Resilient Girls in the Modern World. And I'm a clinical psychologist, and I see a lot of girls and their parents in my practice. So the book has its origins in childhood, not surprisingly, doesn't everything on some level. And I basically grew up with 3 brothers and a good dose of gender bias, right? My parents are extremely loving, but they had some definite ideas about femininity that felt really limiting to me. So one example that's just become family lore is that I asked for a hockey stick growing up. We grew up in Canada. We grew up in Montreal with Les Canadiens, and my brothers all had hockey sticks, and I wanted a hockey stick. Now, my parents obliged, but the problem was that they got me a pink one. And it was a problem for me. When I would push back or get upset about the differences I noticed, they insisted that they didn't treat the boys and me differently or that I was being too sensitive or dramatic. Classic comments that we know girls hear and women hear all the time now, right? So I struggled to hide my feelings to avoid criticism. And it wasn't until I was doing a master's degree that I began to understand my experience more, right? I mentioned in a paper for my developmental psychology class that I was accused of overreacting when I felt demeaned. And the professor scribbled in the margin, "That's what people say to talk girls out of their feelings." And it was such a validating comment for me, right? And I think that my story is every girl's story, even if they may not have gotten a pink hockey stick, but they did get messages that made them feel unseen, unheard, not taken seriously. Anyway, fast forward, I became a clinical psychologist. And I've listened to women and girls for the last 24 years talk about their own gender bias and sexism. And I realized, in not so many words, but I could hear it and realize that it wasn't just me who was impacted by this stuff, right? I've witnessed just how harmful it is to their sense of self, their sense of potential. I write in the book that these are like tiny psychological paper cuts that accumulate and become festering wounds of self-doubt. So, to answer your question, I wrote the book to offer parents deeper awareness and tools, both to fight against the biases that they might not even recognize that they're bringing into their homes, and to help their daughters with the sexism that they're going to experience in the world.
Thank you for writing it. And as this podcast is out, your book has just hit the shelves yesterday. So I encourage everyone to go out and grab a copy of it, request it from their library if they don't have it. And I just finished reading it this morning, and it was a really wonderful book. And I was really reflecting on a couple of things as I was reading it. One is I was thinking about when I grew up in the 70s, and my sister and I had the album Free to Be You and Me on repeat.
Mhm.
I don't know if you grew up with that album. And I was really looking forward to sharing it with my kids because it was such a formative part of our, like, for years we listened to that album. And when I listened to it, I was like, I can't play this for them. Like, times have changed so much that it almost feels like it would be going backwards to introduce them to how sexist things were when I was growing up. I don't know if that makes sense, but like some of them, it's very dated, in other words.
Yeah.
And it gave me this false sense that I think has lasted through my adult life, and that I'm only, as I get older, only becoming more aware of how much it feels like we've, quote, beat sexism, but it's still so incredibly pervasive today, to the point where, as you and I are talking, it's late July and Kamala Harris is running for president, and there's so many choruses of, yeah, but can a woman win? And so we're still in this incredibly, whether you like her or not, she's incredibly experienced. She's got the experience to be president, and she's got the chops, but still people are saying, like, yeah, but can a woman win? And I think just in my own life, as I get older, I just see so much more how still sexist and misogynist our culture is. And so I love that you wrote this book to help us see those subtle ways, that subtle and not so subtle. But as a feminist, like, I thought, I've got this. Like, I thought, I'm raising my kids in this way that is not encouraging them to see gender bias and not have like sexist stuff going on in our home. And I realized that I have fallen prey to all of that. Last summer, my daughter was working at a day camp as a counselor, and she came home and she was telling me and her brother, she was 16, her brother is 19. She was telling us that this person who was like a substitute counselor was who was older, like an adult, like 25 or 26 years old, was inviting her over to her house. She said, do you want to come over for drinks and mani-pedis? And was telling her, and she told my daughter, you've got really great breasts. But she said it with a different word. And I rolled my eyes and was like, oh gosh. And my son was like, Mom, she has to tell her boss about this. And I was like, oh, whatever. It's not a big deal. My son was just shocked. He was like, no, Mom, that's sexual harassment. Like, she has to report that. And I realized how, because of my experiences as a girl in the world, I didn't realize how numb I was to how girls and women are treated. Anyhow, long story short, just to say that even as a feminist who's aware of this stuff, I hadn't realized. And she did end up reporting. The person got talked to and told that they were never coming back. And I was super proud of her for doing that, because it was
kind of have the chills.
Completely inappropriate. But like, because of what happened when I was 16 and beyond, I'm just like, on the scale of things, that's minor. It's not, but
it is. It's so normalized that and it's cool that your son could recognize that and your daughter felt empowered to actually report. It's hard to do, but it's so normalized that we just think it's a fact of life, and not just our generation. Like, I have girls in my practice, I have other teenagers that sort of roll their eyes and say, it's no big deal. If they snap my bra strap or call me ho, but it's just not worth taking on. And there's this way that it's this learned helplessness. Like, we just have to put up with it. And it's like, we actually don't. And of course, we have to pick our battles. But collectively, we have to be saying this is not okay.
How can we recognize our own sort of gender bias and that we are transmitting sexism without meaning to in our homes? What are some ways that you see that happen with parents and children? And what are some things that we can do about it?
It's a great question, right? There's infinite ways that we tell our kids, inadvertently, of course, that they're less capable, interesting, less serious creatures without even realize we're doing it. So like maybe it's that you always have her brother carry the groceries and take out the trash. Maybe it's that she's interrupted more than her brother and mom is interrupted more than dad, because statistically speaking, that is probably going on. Maybe you focus on her appearance and clothes and tend to have conversations about world events with your sons, right? So we, moms especially, we have to sort out our own perceptions and memories so that we're not passing on the disbelief, the denial, or the accusations of hysteria that we grew up with. Like, tell me all the time when they read my book, because I've had early readers, and what they say they're shocked by is the amount of focus that they put on their daughter's appearances, like the number of comments they make about various body parts, right? Even a compliment is an evaluation, and it sends the message that what's most important is your appearance. Parents are also really surprised about the amount of emotional words that they use with their daughters versus the achievement-related language that they use with sons, right? So it's just all of this really subtle ways that we don't recognize as parents because it's so ingrained. It's like in the air we breathe. It's just what you do. And it's really tempting when your daughter comes down in a cute outfit to be like, oh, that's so cute. You look adorable. And they're so beautiful to us. And the other thing that comes to mind is being good, right? The parents will start to recognize, if they pay attention, all the ways that they've expected their daughter to be good. Listen the first time, not get angry, help more and be more accommodating than their sons. I have a mom who wrote to me just the other day and said that she had read an article of mine, right? And she started to notice how uncomfortable she was when her daughter expressed strong opinions, even though her brother, even though her son was always the more outspoken one and usually more critical. And this is the part I love. She admitted to her daughter that she thought she was doing this, and her daughter started to cry because she had known that something was off, and she had complained to her mother that she wasn't listening to her, but she couldn't quite pinpoint why. And so when her mother put the language to it, you have these strong opinions, and I worry about girls having strong opinions, or I worry that being assertive is a bad thing in this culture, even though I know it's not. Like, just naming those things made such a difference.
I love that. Yeah, I definitely had the very conscious idea of trying to raise my daughter to be the words I always thought about was to be as big as she wanted to be. But you also talk about in your book how women are rewarded for being more traditionally feminine and how it can be actually like really risky. I think both literally and figuratively risky to challenge some of those gender norms as girls and women. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think most people today, especially like your listeners, they want their girls to be big. They want them to be outspoken and to just be who they are and to not be limited by gender biases. And yet they're going to run into a lot of pushback, right? So there's a young woman in my book who feels like really incoherent in some situations or inarticulate. And she traces it back, and she's interrupted a lot. She notices at work she's interrupted a lot by men and women. She's hit on by one of her managers who kind of comments on her smoking body and was reminding me of your daughter. And so she chases it back to her parents having, I think she says, ears ears for my brother and eyes for me.
I remember
Right.
that.
And,
That's
and
powerful.
she had
Yeah.
very loving parents, but they nitpicked and complimented her appearance a lot. And so she came to understand that was what was important. In any case, through our therapy, she found her voice. She was able to become more assertive. And then something happened that is not that shouldn't be surprising, but is surprising, is that people started to, especially at work, started to say she was too assertive or started to talk over her even more. And because when women are assertive, it's seen as aggressive. And so part of what I advocate for in the book is talking to our girls about sometimes that will happen. And you're going to have to make a decision in the moment whether or not you back down. But whatever you do, recognize it's not personal, that this is what's happening. Because I really believe that if we help our girls, if we prepare them without scaring them, that's the important part. But if we prepare them for the world, they're going to understand that something is wrong with the culture, not with them.
I love that. I'm going to read a quote from your book that I really liked and ask you a question about it. You wrote that adolescence is the critical moment made up of an abundance of smaller moments of being interrupted, dismissed, ignored. Obviously, I have some feelings about this. Ignored, scolded for being angry, mocked for having strong feelings or opinions. And when girls realize, consciously or not, that women aren't seen as serious creatures, if we want our girls to grow into women who feel deserving of their share of public space to help make the world better, with their ideas and talents to negotiate more effectively for a job and equal pay, to become our future leaders, we need to teach them to feel deep down in their gut that they're entitled to it. How do we teach girls healthy entitlement?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on that. Entitlement is usually a bad word, right? We think of it as people who demand too much. But over and over again, I sit with girls in my practice who don't feel entitled enough, right? So I call it a healthy sense of entitlement. And there's so many ways that we can provide girls with a healthy sense of entitlement if we're conscious of all the ways that their entitlement is being shut down. And in the book, there's sort of 5 voices that I refer to. One of them is trading being liked for being respected, right? Because we really emphasize relationships with girls. That's a good thing. But we often do it at the expense of their own needs, right? And comfort. And so we are passing on this message that that other people's perceptions, comforts, needs are more important than their own. And so we're teaching them to weight their own needs as much as anybody else's. And that sometimes being respected is more important than being liked. I talk about a voice of, really, that's a voice of integrity, right? Staying with what you believe is true, even if it's going to cause disagreement or some conflict. And I go into much more detail about how there is a trade-off, right? That relationships are the lifeblood of girls. And so that they really don't want to make waves. But there is a way to teach them to express disagreement and anger in ways that serve the relationship rather than break apart the relationship. Another sort of not random, but like less connected voice that people would think of is a voice of economic self-sufficiency. Because research finds we do not talk to our girls about money the way that we do our boys. And there's like plenty of evidence that we give boys more allowance than we give girls. It's nuts, really. We save more for college for boys on the whole than we do for girls. So there are all these ways that we're telling girls that, like, you don't have to worry about money. You don't have to know a lot about money. And so if you open a bank account for them, if you teach them to invest, if you give them this voice of economic self-sufficiency, you're helping them feel entitled to money in the ways that boys feel entitled to money. And women save a lot of money, but they're not like encouraged to build wealth in the way that boys are. So there are all these ways that we set boys up to become financially independent that we don't set girls up
Just as a sidebar I want you to go back to your points, but that anecdote in your book about your nephew's economics teacher addressing, like, that is current, right? I got the impression that was current. That
Oh,
was,
yeah, that was 2 years
an
ago.
an economics teacher who told all the boys that they had to be financially astute because women were really looking for a good provider. Like, that was shocking to me. I guess it's not shocking, but it is too, because when I was in high school, I remember my algebra teacher saying girls just aren't good at math. And I was thinking that would never fly today, but maybe it would.
Part of my argument is that we are less likely to say those things. The economics teacher it's weird because it was coming from a good place, but it really sent a message to the girls that they should rely on men. There's all this stuff about how natural it is to just rely on men. But in terms of the algebra comment, like, it probably would in most cases be more subtle today, but it would still be there and it's not less damaging, right? Especially with math and science, there's all these ways that we're passing on messages that boys are just better at math.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's all very eye-opening. So
there's a voice of integrity, right? Which is the trading being liked for being respected. There's a voice of resistance, which is say no, disagree, not suppressing negative feelings. There's a voice of ambition, right? Which is talking to your kids about competition and envy, right? There's a story in the book about my daughter who didn't want to, when she was 8, I think, didn't want to try out for a play because she realized her best friend wanted the same part as her. The best part of that story is that they both it was a production of Annie, and they both wanted to be the dog, Sandy.
I love that. That's your lines.
And so I had to really help her. Like, that's the age when kids start to swallow their voice and start to not want to hurt anybody. And so I had to really work with her on how you deal with your feelings of competition and envy. There's a voice of authority, which is where we talk a lot about male hubris and female humility. And then there's the voice of economic self-sufficiency.
Yeah, those are great. I wonder if you have any thoughts for parents of boys, because, you and I are both parents of boys as well. What are some things we can do or say directly to them, or ways that we can raise sons who are going to not support this whole paradigm of sexism?
Yeah. I ended up including more on boys in the book than I thought I would, because they're both part of the same system and it's hurting both of them. So I think part of the ways we want to help boys see that sexism isn't just bad for girls, but it's also bad for them is because it's so limiting to their humanity. Like, the only emotion they're really allowed to express is anger. And there's this whole other part of them, the tenderness. If you've ever seen small boys, like, they're so big-hearted and tender and they cry, and yet we treat them from the time they're born as little men, right? They're actually born with less developed brains than girls. I think they're something like 6 weeks behind girls. The research shows they actually need more tenderness, but we end up treating them like little men, throwing them in the air. We're rough for them. We treat the girls like they're much more fragile. And really, as babies, they both need the same thing. But to get to your questions of what we can do with boys is, I always say to parents that we're playing the long game, right? Because a lot of times to fit in, they're going along with the whole like macho bro culture stuff. And if I hear it on the phone or I hear it with their friends, I will talk to my son about it later and say, it's not okay to talk about girls' sexuality like that. And there's a story in the book where one of my friends does that to her son, and he's, Mom, even the girls laugh. They don't care if we call them hoe or thought or. And she said, it's not okay to talk about girls in that way. Why should we talk about girls' sexuality in a demeaning way when we don't talk about boys' sexuality in that way? So we're taking the long game. And that's my overall strategy, is like, we're using teachable moments to say these ways of talking and thinking about girls are not okay and that they spread sexism in society, but we're just hoping that they grow up over time and become become good partners and people who want to see equality in the world and equality for themselves, right? The ability to be whoever they are, not some macho man.
Yeah, you also mentioned, and we did have Ruth Whitman was on the podcast a few episodes ago, the author of Boy Moms. So we talked a lot about that, about the differences between boy babies and girl babies and how boy babies need more nurturing and get less over the years. And no wonder we're in the pickle that we're in now and in a lot of ways. And one thing you talked about too, if you have brothers and sisters, making sure that you're not allowing the brothers to talk over the sisters, and and even modeling that the dad is not, if you're in a heterosexual marriage, that the dad is not talking over the mom. And as as I was reading, I was like, oh, that was one thing we were not very good about, because I've got two older boys and my younger is a girl, and they're each 3 years apart. So not only was she the youngest by quite a bit, but they are also very powerful boys who are very confident. And I can think back over the years that she probably felt very, like it was very hard to speak up because she was younger and maybe not as confident. And I'll try to rectify that as much as I can going forward, but I think I could have done a better job about that. So that's something I think that we can watch out for as parents of boys and girls.
Yeah. I had 3 brothers, like I said, growing up. And I said, the only thing worse than being the only girl could have been if I were the youngest girl. So yeah, it is hard when you have when you have brothers who are just conditioned to really believe their voice matters.
Yeah. And even
not just parents, but from the
everyone.
culture and from everything they're seeing on television. There's so much more representation of male voices.
Yeah. And even in our families, my oldest son was much more mild-mannered and more of a quiet kid. But my middle son and my daughter are both like loud and persistent and spirited. And I remember a family member taking me aside when my daughter was about 8 and saying that they thought that I needed to be firmer with her and that she was too persistent. She wouldn't take no for an answer. And the list went on. And I explained to them about my strategy that I told you about, letting her be as big as she wants to be. And it occurred to me reading this book, her behavior was not any different from her brother's behavior. But I think because she was a girl, it was seen as problematic, right? That she was demanding and persistent and spirited. And her brother, no one ever said anything about his behavior to me. And I need to be firmer with him.
Because he's entitled to his voice and his needs and his wants in a way that girls just aren't. Yeah.
Let's shift a little bit and talk about beauty culture. So one thing I was thinking about, and you talk about this, is how can we help our daughters be more aware of beauty culture and the dangers of it, and also still let them feel okay about dressing up and having fun with makeup and clothes and things? Because I think there can be a balance, or maybe am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I think we walk such a fine line, right? Because beauty culture is ingrained in society and it's so much a part of our girls' lives and increasingly more a part of our boys' lives too. So I think that we're going to alienate girls if we just say no makeup, no crop tops. But I think what we want to do, again, with the long games thing, is we want to help them become critical consumers of culture. So I once said to my daughter, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but a crop top, dieting, or a Brazilian wax is never as simple as free choice. So I'm trying to help her understand that that all women deserve choice and her body is her body. And yet our choices are informed by a culture that doesn't always have our best interests in mind. And so I help her understand that fashion's ephemeral. It takes courage to be original. I want her to just be a critical thinker.
Yeah. So understanding that I love how you talk about that. The choice isn't necessarily a choice, that there still is the pressure of all of the cultural beauty ideals and norms that are underlying the choices that you think that you're making in a vacuum.
And once they start to realize, like I've actually witnessed girls realizing, oh, wait, if TikTok and I'm trying to think of a popular girls store, whatever, if TikTok and Lululemon tells me to do it, is that really free choice?
Yeah. So talking about also who gains by all the makeup ads and the things that it's all about buying stuff, really, in the end. That capitalism and patriarchy getting to make our beauty norms.
And combining with selfie culture, right? So they
Mhm.
begin to see themselves as this like collection of body parts rather than a whole human.
Mhm.
And they're sold all this advertising like, oh, I can use this to fix my this flaw or that flaw. I can make my neck smoother. I can make my cheeks glow. I can make my ankles. Like it's just ridiculous the number of things that they have to, of problems they have that can be solved by all of these so-called solutions from
Yeah.
advertisers.
When I was reading your book, the part where you talk about not commenting on appearance, I said to my daughter yesterday, and I had just told her, like, you're so beautiful or something like that. And I said, apparently I'm not supposed to tell you you're beautiful. And I was joking around and she knew I was joking. She's like, Mom, it's just not the only thing you're supposed to tell me. And you tell me lots of other things too. So it's okay. I was
Yeah.
like, all right. But I do find that tough.
We're never going to be perfect. And I don't even think that perfect is never saying anything about their appearance, but just being conscious. The goal is more body neutrality, just focusing more on their achievements and their character.
Mhm.
And there are going to be times when you just feel full of love for how they look. And so you say, you look so beautiful.
Mm.
You can also say you look beautiful when you've had this amazing conversation with them about climate change, or you've just had some big belly laugh with them. And you're like, you're so beautiful. And then they know you mean all of them.
I love that. You've mentioned crop tops a couple times, and I wanted to talk about that because it's come up so many times in my community. Like I have a big free Facebook group for peaceful parenting, and they'll invariably be a question about my daughter wants to wear X, and I don't want her to what quote unquote provocative clothing. And as soon as a couple of years ago, I thought about that word. Like, man, I stopped using it because what we're really saying when we're saying that our daughters are dressing provocatively is not exactly what we think we mean we're saying, right? When you really think about what that word means. And I I went through my own personal journey of deciding where I was going to come down on that. And I personally decided that I was going to talk to my daughter about clothes that are appropriate for what settings, right? If you're going to the art gallery with your father to go to a lecture, probably a crop top and cutoffs is not the right thing to wear. Or if you're going to
Mhm.
grandma's house for dinner, thinking about what's the appropriate dress. But other than that, she wears whatever she wants. How you suggest that we navigate what our daughters want to wear in a way that isn't harmful.
I fall on the side, which sounds similar to you, of putting the relationship first and also teaching them, not controlling them. With my daughter, we've talked a lot about how the culture sexualizes girls. And as parents, we're always walking this fine line between wanting to make sure that we don't align with the dominant culture and sexualize them. And that brings in the word provocative as if they're trying to provoke something. And on the other hand, we want to keep them safe, or we want them to do well in school, but we know when there's a focus on the body, it actually interrupts their flow state. That's an actual thing, right? And so we're always walking this fine line. But in the end, I think it's important that we don't want to interrupt their process of identity development. They're just figuring out who they are, and they're looking around at the culture and what the culture says women is. And especially when they're younger, and I'm not saying, I think when you're 8 years old, you can say a crop top's not appropriate because it's too grown up. We'll talk about it when you grow up.
Mhm.
But when they're a little bit older and they're wanting to, they don't see it as sexual. They see it as, and it is, this is what retailers are pushing, right? And so they just want to fit in with their kids. And so you're walking this fine line of wanting them to fit in while also recognizing that they're being fed a certain vision of what girls should look like.
Yeah, I like that. I also remember, as you were talking, I remember that I would also talk to my daughter about how, even if it isn't right, sometimes when you're wearing things that show a lot of skin, you attract attention that you don't necessarily want to attract. She takes the subway to school. She's like out in a big city on the subway. And I would just say, why don't you throw a hoodie in your bag in case you're feeling uncomfortable on the subway? So she always made sure that she had the ability to cover up if she wasn't feeling, safe, or like if she was attracting attention that she didn't like.
And I think it's okay to say to them, it's not fair that people will look at you like this, but it's going to happen. And if you're uncomfortable with it happening, that doesn't mean you have to change, but you can think about what story you want your clothes to tell about you.
Mhm.
And so we're putting the ball in their court, but we're giving them the information they need to make choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so hard, isn't it? Towards the end of your book, you talk about safety and about the very real threat that there still is to women out in the world in a lot of ways, whether it's from unwanted advances to assault. And you had a quote that, and I'm not going to cry during this quote. You said you're aware that you're requesting that your daughter swap her daydreams and musings, where ideas and creativity are so often born, for vigilance. And you're also aware that you're contradicting yourself by asking her to watch her back. It's the opposite message that you've given her whole life. Be large, be whoever you want to be, think whatever you want, and don't worry about others. How do you suggest that we find that balance between safety and, I guess, letting them be as big as they want to be in the reality of the world in which we live?
It's such a good question. I think what I say in the book is that I acknowledge my contradictions, right? I want you to be so big and be who you are and dress how you want. And I want you to be safe. And sometimes those two things are not compatible. But also, what I want parents to remember is that people in everything from bikinis to burqas are sexually assaulted.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's no research showing that if you're wearing a certain outfit, you're more likely to be hurt. And most abuse and assault happens with people that they know, that it's not usually a stranger on the street.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm really glad that you brought up the point that, because we were just talking about clothes, this actually, a couple of months ago, my daughter was on her way out and I wasn't home, and my husband it's been a little harder for him to embrace the letting her wear whatever she wants to wear. And he made a comment about the short shorts that she was wearing that you couldn't see with the long shirt that she had on. And he wanted her to change because he thought it would look like she wasn't wearing any pants and he didn't want her to go on the subway. And actually, my son told me later that I didn't even know this had happened. And he said, "Oh, Dad and I got into it a little bit." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Dad was trying to get my sister to change. And I got into it with him about it doesn't matter what girls are wearing because they get unwanted attention no matter what they're wearing." And I think that is just good to point out too. And also proud of my son.
I love your son.
He's pretty great. He's pretty outspoken about this stuff. And so, yeah, his point, which is true, is that in no matter how old you are, no matter what you look like, no matter what you're wearing, it's hard to go out in the world as a woman or a girl and not get unwanted attention.
Yeah. And we want our girls to know it's not their responsibility to make it stop,
Mm-hmm.
but that also it may happen if they're wearing a shirt that looks like there's no pants underneath. Although I will also say that's really part of the style now, right?
Yeah.
Your daughter is not alone in that. And so most people know that. And we see the shorts, even if we don't see the shorts.
Yeah.
But if she's being hit on or if she's on the subway with some older man who should not be looking at her anyway,
Mm-hmm.
he may think that. That's not her problem unless he makes it her problem. And
Yeah. Oh, it's so hard. And it's still so hard. And I wish that weren't still having these conversations today. And I hope that we do get our first woman president.
oh gosh, me too.
Thank you so much for coming on. I encourage everyone to get your book, and I appreciate your conversation. Is there anything that you want our listeners to know about in terms of the topic of your book that I didn't ask you about?
I don't think so. I think you asked a lot of great questions. I think often people think that sexism is behind us because, like I said, it might be more subtle, but it is no less damaging. The more we understand that, the more progress we can make, both in our girls' sense of self and self-esteem and in fighting it in the culture.
Thank you for your part in fighting it in the culture. I really appreciate it. And I hope lots of parents get their hands on this. I also want to say I signed up for your Substack, And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And you have a great download. Say the name of it.
It's 11 Foundational Principles for Raising Gender Equal Kids.
Yes. So that's a free download that you have. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I also, in reading one of your Substack posts, there are some great concrete things that you can do in your everyday conversations. Talk about you're watching men's basketball and not just basketball.
Yeah, that's why it's a newsletter that, you can find on my Substack, and it's 30 Acts of Microfeminism.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a really popular one. And then everybody in the comments is adding more and more
great
acts that they use to.
We'll link to that too, because I really liked that list. It was really great. Okay, so final question, and it's a question I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself? And it can be about anything.
Yeah, I would give myself the advice to not be so self-blaming. I'm a psychologist, and I really believe that nurture has a huge impact. But I didn't value nature as much as I should have. And so my son, who was a really difficult little guy in terms of his temperament and his anxiety and his ability to self-regulate, and he was my first. So I spent a lot of time bashing myself over the head. And I really think that wasn't good for him, because if I had more perspective, I could have dealt with his issues more. And eventually I did, right? I caught on. But I spent a couple of years that I didn't need to, just saying, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with my parenting? I thought I had this thing. I'm a psychologist after all.
That's going to resonate with so many of the people in my community and our listeners, because a lot of people who do turn to studying parenting and listening to parenting books and podcasts often have kids who are probably more like your older son. And if they don't have, a lot of them sometimes end up having another child who's easier. And then they say, oh, it wasn't all about, I wasn't doing anything, quote, wrong. It's just that this kid is.
That's what happened.
Yeah. Is that what happened with you? Yeah. My first kid was so much more sensitive or spirited or whatever than my second. And so I appreciate that advice to not be so self-blaming and to consider the nature as well as the nurture. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you.
You too. And I encourage everybody to go out and get Jo Ann's book, and we'll put links to your Substack and anything else you want people to, other places to find out more about any other places for people to go to find out more about you and what you do.
Sure. You can find me at joannfinkelstein.com, and that will lead you everywhere. But I do have a pretty active Instagram, which is joannfinkelstein.phd.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We'll put links to all of those in the show notes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.